A millionaire on his deathbed finds four identical girls, hungry and huddled together in the rain. Ignoring the doctors and bureaucracy, he takes them to his mansion and decides to adopt them. The system tries to separate them, but what these children do when he falls into a coma shocks even the judges. No one expected four street orphans to become the only thing capable of keeping a man alive. This story will move you. Watch it until the end. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the tinted windows of Richard Townsend's armored Bentley as it crawled through the snow-covered streets. Even in the warmth of the luxury vehicle, the 70-year-old real estate magnate couldn't stop shivering. His personal nurse, Ms. Jenkins, adjusted the cashmere blanket around his legs while monitoring the portable oxygen tank beside him. "Mr. Townsend, we should head back to Riverside Drive. The weather is worsening and your oxygen levels are dropping again," she said, concern etched into her face. Richard ignored her, his gaze fixed on the concrete jungle he had helped build. Townsend Tower, Lakeside Complex, the Manhattan Heights, monuments to his business acumen. And yet, as the specialist at Mount Sinai had confirmed last month, his lungs were failing him, scarred beyond repair by the same idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis that had taken his father decades earlier. "A detour," Richard whispered between labored breaths. "I want to see Central Park in the snow one more time." The driver nodded silently, taking the next turn. The Bentley glided past the empty streets, most New Yorkers having sought shelter from the blizzard. The digital clock on the dashboard read 9:47 p.m. Just another sleepless night for a man who had built an empire, but never a home. As they approached the park's southern edge, Richard noticed four small figures huddled beneath the awning of a closed cafe. He squinted through the snow and fog on the window. Four little girls, identical in appearance, wore mismatched winter clothes that seemed too thin for the biting cold. Their breath formed small clouds in the freezing air as they held onto each other, the tallest one clearly trying to shield the others from the wind. "Stop the car," Richard commanded, his voice suddenly stronger than it had been in weeks. "Mr. Townsend, your doctor specifically said, 'Stop the car now, Davis.'" The driver pulled over obediently. Before Ms. Jenkins could protest further, Richard had already unlocked his door and was struggling to step out into the snow. The cold air hit his lungs like 1,000 needles, but he pushed forward, leaning heavily on his cane. The four girls, all with the same chestnut hair and freckled faces, looked up as he approached. Their ages were difficult to determine, but Richard guessed around 8 or 9. The tallest one immediately stepped forward, putting herself between her sisters and the approaching stranger. "We're not doing anything wrong," she declared, her voice small but defiant. "The shelter was full, and we're just waiting for the storm to pass." Richard raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, fighting to control his breathing. "But it's dangerous to be out in this weather. Where are your parents?" The girls exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. The tallest one, clearly the leader, spoke again. "We take care of ourselves just fine." Behind Richard, Ms. Jenkins had caught up, carrying his portable oxygen. "Mr. Townsend, please, you need to get back into the car immediately." But Richard couldn't tear his gaze away from the four identical faces. Something about them struck a chord deep within him. Perhaps it was the fierce protection in the leader's eyes, or the way another sister clutched a worn sketchbook to her chest despite the cold, or how the third managed a hopeful smile despite their circumstances, or the haunting silence of the smallest, who stared at him with eyes that seemed much older than her years. In that moment, the memories crashed over him like waves. The East Harlem orphanage where he'd spent his early years before being adopted by the wealthy Townsend family. The coldness of those winter nights. The promise he'd made to himself to one day give back, but had never fulfilled. "I have a warm house," Richard said, his voice softening. "Food, hot chocolate, and enough room for all of you. Just for tonight, until the storm passes." The leader looked skeptical. "Why would you help us?" "Because," Richard replied, "a long time ago I was you." Another wave of coughing seized him, and Ms. Jenkins rushed to adjust his oxygen flow. The smallest girl, who hadn't spoken a word, stepped forward unexpectedly. She reached out a tiny hand and placed it gently on Richard's arm, her touch light as a snowflake. The simple gesture conveyed more understanding than words could express. "Emma," whispered one of the middle sisters to the leader, "maybe we should go, just for tonight." Emma hesitated, weighing their limited options against the risks of trusting a stranger. Finally, she nodded. "Just until the storm passes," she agreed, "and we stay together, always together." Within minutes, the four girls were seated in the back of Richard's Bentley, wrapped in emergency blankets Miss Jenkins kept in the car. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Richard observed them in the rearview mirror. Emma, alert and watchful, the artistic one still clutching her sketchbook, the smiling one who had already engaged Davis in conversation about the car's features, and the silent one whose gaze never left Richard's face. Back at Townsend Manor, a sprawling limestone mansion overlooking the Hudson River, the staff scrambled to prepare rooms for the unexpected guests. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had served the Townsend family for over 30 years, directed the preparation of hot soup and sandwiches while giving Richard disapproving glances. "4 children, Mr. Townsend, with your condition," she muttered as she passed him in the hallway. Richard watched as the girls took in their surroundings with wide eyes, the soaring ceilings, the original artwork, the grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. They stayed clustered together, following Emma's lead as she cautiously accepted Mrs. Henderson's offer to show them to the guest bathrooms for hot showers. "Not separate rooms," Emma insisted, when Mrs. Henderson mentioned preparing individual accommodations. "We need to be together." Richard nodded from his armchair near the fireplace. "Prepare the East Wing guest suite," he instructed. "It has a sitting room with enough space for 4 beds." As the girls disappeared upstairs with Mrs. Henderson, Richard picked up his phone and called Jonathan Russell, his attorney and oldest friend. "John, I need you at the house first thing tomorrow morning," he said without preamble. "I found them." "Found who, Richard?" came the confused response. Richard gazed at the falling snow outside his window, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. "The heirs to everything I've built," he answered. 4 girls who need a home, and I'm going to adopt them." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Richard," Jonathan finally said, his voice gentle but firm, "you know that's not how adoption works, especially not with your health situation. The courts would never—" "Then we'll find a way to make it work," Richard interrupted. "These girls belong here, John. I knew it the moment I saw them." After ending the call, Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaustion setting in. The medical equipment surrounding him, the oxygen concentrator, the medication dispensers, the vital sign monitors, were stark reminders of his condition. The specialists had given him months, not years. But as he listened to the distant sounds of children's voices echoing through his empty mansion for the first time, Richard Townsend made a decision. Whatever time he had left would be devoted to giving these 4 girls the home they deserved. And perhaps in doing so, he might finally build the one thing his billions could never buy: a family. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Townsend Manor as Richard sat in his study, listening to Jonathan Russell's legal assessment. The attorney paced the room, his normally composed demeanor replaced with obvious concern. "Richard, I've spent the entire night researching, and I need you to understand what you're up against," Jonathan said, placing a thick folder on the mahogany desk. "These girls have no documentation, no birth certificates, no school records, nothing. The standard adoption process would take years, not weeks or months. Years you don't." He trailed off, uncomfortable with finishing the sentence. "Years I don't have," Richard completed for him, adjusting the nasal cannula that delivered his oxygen. "I'm aware of my prognosis, John, but these girls need stability now, not after some bureaucratic marathon." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's more. The courts will search for relatives, conduct home studies, require medical evaluations of your fitness as a guardian. And with your condition—" "My condition doesn't affect my ability to provide for them," Richard interrupted, his voice firm despite its weakness. "I have the resources to give them everything they need, including a team of caregivers who can assist when I'm indisposed." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Henderson entered, her usually stern expression softened slightly. "The girls are awake, Mr. Townsend. I've prepared breakfast in the conservatory as you requested." Richard nodded. "Tell them I'll join them shortly." Once Mrs. Henderson had left, he turned back to Jonathan. "Come meet them. See for yourself." The conservatory, a glass-enclosed garden room filled with tropical plants, had been transformed into a breakfast area with a round table set for 5. As Richard and Jonathan entered, they found the 4 girls already seated, their hair still damp from morning showers, dressed in new clothes. Mrs. Henderson had somehow procured overnight. Emma, the leader, immediately stood up. "We should leave after breakfast," she announced. "The storm has stopped." Richard gestured for her to sit back down. "There's no rush. I'd like you all to stay a bit longer if you're willing." The second sister, who had introduced herself as Sophie, was already sketching the room's elaborate glass ceiling on a napkin. "This place has amazing light," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "You like to draw?" Richard asked, taking a seat at the table. Sophie looked up, momentarily surprised at being directly addressed. "I draw what I see," she said simply. Then, after a pause, added, "and sometimes what I feel." "Sophie's the best artist ever," declared the third sister, Lily, reaching for a muffin with obvious delight. "She could be famous someday, I keep telling her." "Lily," Emma warned, "we talked about this." Richard observed their interaction with fascination. Despite being identical quadruplets, their personalities were distinctly their own. Emma, the protective guardian; Sophie, the thoughtful artist; Lily, the effervescent optimist; and Zoe, the silent observer who had yet to speak a single word, but whose eyes missed nothing. "Girls," Richard said, "I'd like you to meet my friend, Jonathan Russell. He's an attorney." Emma's posture immediately stiffened. "We didn't break any laws." Jonathan smiled reassuringly. "I'm not that kind of attorney. I help Mr. Townsend with his business and personal affairs. And right now," Richard continued, "I'm discussing with him how you 4 might stay here, permanently." The statement hung in the air. Even Lily stopped mid-bite, her usual smile faltering. "Why would you want that?" Emma asked, suspicion evident in her voice. Richard considered his answer carefully. "Because this house has been empty for too long. Because I have more than I could ever need and no one to share it with. Because," he paused, searching for words that wouldn't frighten them, "because I believe we might be good for each other." "People don't just take in 4 kids," Emma said flatly. "Especially not rich people. There's always a catch." "Emma's right," Sophie added quietly. "The last family that took us in wanted to separate us, send us to different schools." "No one is separating you," Richard assured them firmly. "That's a promise." Lily perked up. "So we'd all live here together with you?" Richard nodded. "If that's what you want." "What about when you get too sick?" Emma challenged, giving voice to the elephant in the room. "We know about your oxygen and your medicine. We're not babies." The directness of her question caught Richard off guard. He exchanged glances with Jonathan before answering. "I am sick," he acknowledged. "But I've made arrangements to ensure you would be cared for together no matter what happens." Emma seemed unconvinced but said nothing more. It was Zoe who surprised everyone by sliding off her chair and walking over to Richard. She studied his face intently, then gently touched the tube running from the portable oxygen tank to his nose. Without a word, she returned to her seat and picked up her spoon, resuming her breakfast as if she'd reached some private conclusion. Over the next days, a tentative routine began to form. Richard arranged for tutors to assess the girls' education levels, discovering they were remarkably advanced in some areas and behind in others, the result of sporadic schooling. Ms. Jenkins expanded her duties to include monitoring the girls' health, scheduling comprehensive checkups that revealed they were generally healthy but underweight. Emma gradually took on a role in household decisions, working with Mrs. Henderson to establish routines and rules that made the girls feel secure. "No one sleeps alone" became the first rule, followed by others. "All suites are divided equally. If Richard is coughing, call Miss Jenkins immediately. No secrets about how we feel. Sophie discovered the Manor's library and spent hours among the shelves, emerging only when Richard provided her with professional-grade art supplies. She began filling sketchbooks with drawings of the house, the gardens, and increasingly, portraits of Richard that captured both his physical frailty and inner strength. Lily befriended every staff member within days, learning their names, families, and life stories. She brought a lightness to the household that had been absent for years, her laughter echoing through rooms that had known only the sounds of medical equipment. Zoe remained silent, but communicated in her own way. She followed, Richard like a shadow when his strength permitted walks through the gardens. She would arrange his medication bottles in neat rows, bring him glasses of water without being asked, and sit beside him during his breathing treatments, her presence oddly comforting. Jonathan visited regularly, bringing updates on his legal research and observing the developing bonds with mixed emotions, happiness for his friend, but concern for the inevitable complications. The good news, he reported one evening while the girls were upstairs with their tutor, is that I've found a legal pathway that might work. It's complex and will require multiple court appearances, but it's possible. And the bad news? Richard asked. Your nephew Matthew has been asking questions, specifically about changes to your will and estate planning. Richard's expression hardened. Matthew hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, not since I removed him from the company board. He's heard rumors about the girls. He's concerned about his inheritance. His inheritance, Richard repeated with a bitter laugh that triggered a coughing fit. When he recovered, he continued, Tell Matthew if he's concerned about his inheritance. He's welcome to visit his dying uncle, instead of sending his lawyers to inquire. Later that evening, Richard found himself unable to sleep. He made his way to the kitchen for tea, surprised to find Sophie sitting at the counter, sketching by the light of a single lamp. Couldn't sleep, he asked, keeping his voice low. Sophie shook her head. I wanted to finish this, she said, turning her sketchbook around. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It was a portrait of him, but not as he was now. In Sophie's drawing, he looked healthy, strong, standing with the 4 girls in the Manor's garden. It was a future that couldn't exist, yet she had rendered it with such conviction that for a moment, he almost believed it possible. Do you like it? Sophie asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. Richard carefully took the drawing, emotions he thought he'd buried years ago rising to the surface. It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received, he said truthfully. May I keep it? Sophie nodded, a small smile forming. I made it for you. She hesitated, then added, Emma says we shouldn't get attached, that it won't last. What do you think? Richard asked gently. Sophie considered the question with the seriousness only a child could bring to such a moment. I think sometimes people find each other when they need each other most. Even if it's just for a little while. From the doorway came a small sound. They turned to find Zoe watching them, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit. Without a word, she crossed to the refrigerator, took out a container of yogurt, and brought it to Richard along with a spoon. Is this for me? He asked, confused. Zoe nodded solemnly. Then, in a gesture that left both Richard and Sophie stunned, she offered him the first spoonful, a silent covenant that said more than words ever could. The weeks that followed brought a series of firsts that transformed Townsend Manor from a sterile monument to wealth into something Richard had never imagined possible. A home. Each day seemed to bring new discoveries, new connections, new reasons for Richard to fight against the relentless progression of his illness. Mr. Townsend, Dr. Garcia said during her weekly house call, reviewing his latest test results with a puzzled expression. Your lung function has stabilized. It's not improvement exactly, but the decline has slowed considerably. Richard sat in his study, watching through the window as the girls built a snowman in the garden. Is that unusual? With idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis? Yes, quite unusual. The disease typically follows a predictable pattern of deterioration. She closed her tablet and observed him thoughtfully. Your oxygen saturation is better. Your inflammation markers are down and you've gained 3 pounds. The only significant change in your routine is the girls, Richard finished for her. Dr. Garcia nodded. The psychological impact of positive life changes shouldn't be underestimated. I've seen it before. Patients who find purpose often experience unexpected plateaus in disease progression. Richard didn't share the doctor's clinical detachment. He knew what was happening. For the first time in decades, he had a reason to get out of bed each morning that had nothing to do with business acquisitions or stock prices. He had 4 reasons, in fact. The February snow gave way to March rain and then April sunshine. Jonathan continued navigating the labyrinthine adoption process, filing petitions, arranging interviews with social workers, and building a case for Richard's guardianship, despite his health challenges. The home study went well, Jonathan reported after the social worker's 3rd visit. Mrs. Harrison was impressed by the educational plan you've implemented and the stability of the household, but she's still concerned about your health and the lack of information about the girl's background. Richard nodded, understanding the obstacles they faced. The girls themselves knew little about their origins, only that their mother had passed away the previous year, leaving Emma as their protector. They had no documentation, no known relatives, and a history of transience that made traditional adoption pathways nearly impossible. But what they lacked in paperwork, they made up for in the bonds that grew stronger each day. Emma began joining Richard for his morning business calls, absorbing complex real estate concepts with remarkable quickness. Sophie's artwork now lined the hallways, bringing color to spaces that had been deliberately neutral for decades. Lily organized the household staff into a makeshift choir, filling Sunday afternoons with impromptu concerts. And Zoe, still largely silent, communicated through small, meaningful gestures, straightening Richard's tie before meetings, bringing him specific books from the library that somehow always matched his mood. On a perfect May morning, Richard surprised the girls with an announcement at breakfast. "Pack overnight bags," he instructed, trying to suppress his smile at their curious expressions. "We're taking a trip." 4 hours later, their helicopter landed on a private stretch of beach on Long Island's North Fork. As the girls stepped onto the sand, their identical faces registered identical wonder. "Is this all yours?" Emma asked, surveying the pristine coastline that stretched in both directions. "Ours," Richard corrected gently. "I purchased this property 20 years ago, but never developed it. I always thought someday I might build something special here." The day unfolded like a dream sequence. A picnic lunch on the beach, swimming lessons in the shallows, Richard watching from a beach chair, his oxygen tank beside him, and then the centerpiece of his surprise, a professional sandcastle builder who arrived with trucks full of specialized tools. "Today," Richard announced, "we're building Townsend Castle, with 4 towers, 1 for each of you." For hours they worked together, Richard directing from his chair when his strength flagged, the girls throwing themselves into the project with determination. By sunset, an elaborate sandcastle stood at the water's edge, complete with 4 distinct towers, Emma's strong and fortified, Sophie's artistic and detailed, Lily's whimsical and adorned with shells, and Zoe's simplest but somehow perfect in its proportions. As they gathered around a bonfire that evening, Richard captured a photo of the 4 girls silhouetted against their creation and the setting sun. It was, he realized, the first family photo he had taken in over 30 years. "Will it still be here tomorrow?" Lily asked, watching the gentle waves creeping closer to their castle. "No," Richard answered honestly. "The tide will take it tonight. But that's the beauty of it. We can build another one, different and maybe even better next time we visit." Emma, ever practical, looked troubled. Then what was the point? All that work just to disappear? Richard considered her question carefully. "Some of the most valuable things in life are temporary, Emma. Their worth isn't in how long they last, but in the joy they bring while they exist and the memories they leave behind." That night, sleeping in the beachfront cottage he'd arranged, Richard was awakened by a soft touch on his arm. He opened his eyes to find Zoe standing beside his bed, her small face serious in the moonlight. She tugged at his hand, clearly wanting him to follow. Concerned, he attached his portable oxygen and followed her out onto the cottage porch. There, to his astonishment, the other three girls waited, all in their pajamas. Without explanation, they led him down to the beach where the full moon illuminated their sandcastle, still standing, the tide having unexpectedly receded without reaching it. "See?" Lily whispered excitedly. "Sometimes things last longer than you think they will." The significance of the moment wasn't lost on Richard. The girls had awakened in the night, checked on their creation, and wanted to share this small miracle with him. They had chosen him as their family. Back in New York, the calendar filled with more firsts, a Townsend family game night that became a weekly tradition, a June birthday celebration for all four girls, their actual birth date unknown. Richard had selected the day he'd found them, the planting of a yellow oak tree on the manor grounds as a symbol of their growing roots, and a magical snow night in July, created by special effects experts who transformed the ballroom into a winter wonderland to fulfill Lily's impossible wish. The social worker visits continued, each report more positive than the last. The girls flourished under the stability Richard provided. Their health improved, their education accelerated, and their individual personalities blossomed. Emma relaxed her vigilance enough to enjoy childhood pleasures. Sophie's art gained complexity and depth. Lily's natural leadership emerged in her organization of household activities, and Zoe, though still using words sparingly, began communicating more, especially with Richard. Yet beneath the joy ran an undercurrent of urgency that Richard couldn't ignore. Despite Dr. Garcia's surprise at his relative stability, he knew his condition could worsen at any moment. The legal adoption remained in limbo, with courts requiring more documentation, more assessments, more time, the one thing Richard couldn't guarantee. "We need to try a different approach," Jonathan advised during a private meeting in late July. "Judge Harriman is sympathetic to your case, but her hands are tied by regulatory requirements. However, there might be another path. Temporary guardianship first, then a transition to permanent adoption. It's still complicated, but potentially faster." Richard agreed, willing to pursue any avenue that would secure the girl's future. What he didn't share with Jonathan was his growing concern about Matthew. His nephew had made no direct contact, but Richard's security team had reported unusual interest in the manor's comings and goings. Cars parked nearby for hours, photography of the property, inquiries to staff members when they left the grounds. As July turned to August, Richard decided to fulfill another promise, a proper summer vacation. He arranged for a trip to his ranch in Wyoming, where the girls could experience the mountains, learn to ride horses, and escape the humidity of New York. The night before their departure, Richard found Emma sitting alone on the terrace, staring at the yellow oak they had planted. "Trouble sleeping?" he asked, joining her. Emma shrugged. "Just thinking." "Care to share those thoughts?" She hesitated, then said, "We're really going to Wyoming tomorrow. All of us? You're well enough?" "Dr. Garcia has approved the trip," Richard assured her. "The ranch house is fully equipped with everything I need medically, and Ms. Jenkins will travel with us." Emma nodded, but Richard could sense her unease. "There's something else bothering you," he prompted gently. "What happens if you get worse while we're there?" she finally asked, the question that clearly had been weighing on her. "What happens to us if something happens to you?" Richard had prepared for this conversation, knowing it was inevitable. "I've made arrangements," he said carefully. "Legal documents that ensure you four will always stay together, always be cared for no matter what happens to me." "But not here," Emma said, displaying her perceptiveness. "Not at the manor, because of your nephew." Richard blinked in surprise. "How do you know about Matthew?" "I listen," Emma said simply. "When you and Mr. Russell talk, when the staff whispers, I need to know what threats are out there." The weight of responsibility on her young shoulders struck Richard anew. "Matthew is complicated," he acknowledged, "but he has no power over your future. I've made sure of that." "He thinks we're after your money," Emma stated matter-of-factly. "That we're manipulating you. And what do you think?" Emma looked at him directly, her expression older than her years. "I think you were alone. And we were alone." and now none of us are alone anymore." She paused, then added with uncharacteristic vulnerability, "I've never been to Wyoming." Richard smiled, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. "Then we have another first to look forward to tomorrow." What neither of them knew as they sat peacefully on the terrace was that their carefully constructed world was about to face its greatest challenge. While the Townsend family prepared for their Western adventure, Matthew Townsend sat in his Manhattan apartment, reviewing documents provided by a private investigator, documents that would soon threaten everything Richard had built. The Wyoming trip was cut short on its third day when Richard suffered a severe respiratory episode. One moment he was watching the girls ride horses in the ranch's corral. The next, he was fighting for breath, his oxygen levels plummeting despite the supplemental flow from his portable tank. The ranch's emergency protocols activated with swift efficiency, a helicopter transfer to the nearest hospital in Jackson, stabilization in the ICU, and immediate notification to Dr. Garcia back in New York. For 36 hours, Richard drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the urgent medical activity surrounding him and the crushing fear that he wouldn't see the girls again. When he finally stabilized enough for transfer back to New York, Richard insisted on seeing the girls before boarding the medical transport plane. They were brought to his hospital room, their identical faces pale with worry. "It's just a setback," he assured them, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be back at the manor by tomorrow evening." Emma, ever perceptive, studied the medical equipment surrounding him with a skeptical expression. Sophie clutched her sketchbook, but hadn't drawn a single line since his collapse. Lily's characteristic smile was absent, replaced by a trembling lower lip she tried desperately to control. And Zoe, silent Zoe, had retreated further into herself, standing slightly apart from her sisters, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Girls," Miss Jenkins said gently, "Mr. Townsend needs to rest before the flight. Say your goodbyes for now." One by one, they approached his bed. Emma squeezed his hand firmly, as if trying to transfer her strength to him. Sophie placed a folded piece of paper under his pillow without explanation. Lily leaned in for a careful hug, whispering, "You have to get better because we still haven't taught you our secret handshake." Zoe simply touched his oxygen tube, her small fingers tracing its path to his nose, in what had become her unique gesture of concern. The flight back to New York was a blur for Richard. By the time they reached the manor, his fever had returned, and he was immediately settled in the medical suite that occupied what had once been the East Wing master bedroom. Dr. Garcia arrived with a team of specialists, and the diagnosis was delivered in clinical terms that couldn't disguise the severity: acute exacerbation of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, complicated by secondary pneumonia. "We've adjusted your medication," Dr. Garcia explained, "and installed enhanced oxygen delivery systems. The good news is we caught it relatively early. The concerning news is that these exacerbations often indicate disease progression." Richard nodded weakly. "What are my next steps?" Dr. Garcia hesitated. "Complete rest, limited visitors, and..." She glanced at her colleagues before continuing. "It might be time to consider placement on the lung transplant evaluation list." After the medical team departed, Jonathan arrived, his face grave. "Richard, we need to talk about Matthew." Richard gestured toward the chair beside his bed. "What's happened?" "He's filed a petition with the family court," Jonathan said, pulling out legal documents. "He's challenging your guardianship application for the girls, claiming your health makes you unfit, and suggesting the sudden introduction of 4 children into your life represents undue influence from opportunistic minors." Richard's monitor showed his heart rate increasing. "Those are his exact words?" Jonathan nodded grimly. "There's more. He simultaneously filed for conservatorship over your estate, citing your medical condition and erratic decision-making. He's included affidavits from former business associates questioning your cognitive capacity." "That's absurd," Richard managed between labored breaths. "I'm ill, not incompetent." "We'll fight it," Jonathan assured him, but I need to warn you, he's requesting an emergency hearing and he's hired Samantha Winters. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Samantha Winters was one of the most aggressive family court attorneys in New York, known for her theatrical courtroom tactics and ruthless pursuit of wealthy clients' interests. When is the hearing? Next week. Judge Harriman has been assigned to the case, which is our one piece of good luck. She's familiar with your adoption application and unlikely to be swayed by theatrics. Richard nodded, his mind already working through strategies despite his physical weakness. We need to prepare the girls. They'll need to testify. Jonathan looked uncomfortable. Richard, are you sure that's wise? Exposing them to cross-examination by Winters could be traumatic. They're stronger than you think, Richard replied, and their voices need to be heard. He paused, then asked, how are they doing? Since we returned? Jonathan's expression softened. They're worried about you. Mrs. Henderson says they've barely left the library, which apparently has the best view of the hallway leading to your room. They've been taking shifts watching for any movement. The image brought a faint smile to Richard's face. He reached under his pillow and pulled out the folded paper Sophie had left him, a portrait of all 5 of them, standing together beneath the yellow oak tree they had planted. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Family is stronger than sickness." "Let me see them," Richard requested. Dr. Garcia said limited visitors. "John, please, I need to see them." 20 minutes later, the 4 girls entered Richard's room, their expressions a mixture of relief and apprehension at the sight of him surrounded by medical equipment. Ms. Jenkins hovered in the background, ready to intervene, if the visit proved too taxing. "Girls," Richard began, gesturing for them to come closer, "we need to talk about something important." He explained Matthew's legal challenge in simple terms, watching their reactions carefully. Emma's face hardened into determination. Sophie withdrew slightly. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and Zoe moved closer to Richard's bed, as if physically positioning herself as his protector. "So he wants to take us away from you?" Emma asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. "And take control of your money," Sophie added quietly, surprising everyone with her business acumen. Richard nodded. "Yes to both, but Jonathan and I are fighting it. The judge will want to hear from you girls to understand what you want." "We want to stay with you," Lily said immediately, wiping away tears. "We'll tell the judge that." "It might not be that simple," Richard cautioned. "Matthew's lawyer will ask difficult questions. She might suggest you're better off in a home where the parent isn't sick." Emma's expression turned fierce. "We've taken care of sick people before. Our mom was sick for a long time before she..." She stopped, unable to finish. "Before she left," Zoe completed unexpectedly, her voice soft but clear, startling everyone. It was the first complete sentence they'd heard from her in months. The simple statement hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Richard realized this was the first time any of the girls had directly referenced their mother's passing. "Yes," Emma nodded, reaching for Zoe's hand. "Before she left us, and we managed. We took care of each other then, and we can help take care of you now." Richard felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with his lung condition. "I know you can," he said gently, "but my job is to take care of you, not the other way around." "That's not how family works," Sophie interjected, her voice quiet but firm. "In a real family, everyone takes care of everyone." The wisdom in her statement struck Richard deeply. Before he could respond, the monitoring equipment began chiming, indicating his oxygen levels were dropping, a sign he was overexerting himself. Miss Jenkins stepped forward. "Girls, Mr. Townsend needs to rest now." They reluctantly prepared to leave, but Richard caught Emma's hand. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "bring me the estate plans for the Riverside project. I could use your perspective." The gesture wasn't lost on her. He was including her in his work, treating her as a partner rather than a child to be protected. Emma nodded, squeezing his hand before following her sisters from the room. Left alone, Richard's thoughts turned to Matthew. He hadn't always been an adversary. Once he had been a bright, idealistic young man with innovative ideas about using Townsend resources for social good. Richard had brought him into the company after his brother's passing, positioning him as an apprentice, in the hopes he would eventually take over. Then came the board meeting 6 years ago, when Matthew had presented his plan to convert Townsend properties into affordable housing and community centers. Richard had publicly criticized the proposal as financially unsound, effectively humiliating his nephew in front of the company's leadership. The relationship had never recovered, with Matthew growing increasingly bitter and ambitious, eventually attempting a hostile takeover that led to his removal from the board. Now, watching the news coverage of his latest Riverside development on the silent television, Richard was struck by the irony. Matthew's vision of using Townsend resources for social good was exactly what Richard himself now wanted to accomplish through his relationship with the girls. Perhaps he had been wrong all along. These reflections were interrupted by raised voices outside his door. He recognized Emma's determined tone, then Lily's pleading one, followed by Sophie's attempted mediation. The door was thick enough to muffle the exact words, but the emotional tenor was clear. They were arguing. Miss Jenkins entered a moment later, looking concerned. "The girls are having a bit of a disagreement," she explained diplomatically. "Mrs. Henderson is trying to settle them down." Over the next few hours, Richard dozed fitfully, awakening occasionally to check the time or adjust his position. Nearly midnight, he was startled fully awake by the sound of his door creaking open. Zoe slipped into the room like a small ghost, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against her chest. "Zoe?" Richard whispered. "Is everything all right?" She approached his bed and placed her rabbit beside his pillow, a gesture so tender it nearly undid him. Then, to his surprise, she spoke again. "Emma and Sophie had a fight," she whispered. "About you being sick. Emma said Sophie doesn't care enough because she just draws instead of helping." Her voice quavered slightly. Lily tried to make them feel better, but Emma called her annoying. And then Emma said, "If you go away, we'll get separated." She said it would be Sophie's fault. The pain in Zoe's eyes as she relayed this information was unbearable. Richard reached for her hand, finding it cold and trembling. "Your sisters are scared," he explained gently. "Fear sometimes makes people say things they don't mean. Emma carries a heavy burden, feeling responsible for all of you." Zoe nodded solemnly. "Like Mom did." "Yes," Richard agreed, "and Sophie processes her feelings through art, while Lily tries to bring light to dark situations. You each cope differently, but you're strongest together." Zoe considered this, then said, with the simple clarity of a child, "We should be together now, all of us." Without waiting for a response, she slipped back out of the room. Richard thought she'd gone to bed until 15 minutes later, his door opened again. This time, all 4 girls entered, Emma leading the way with an air of determined reconciliation. They had dragged pillows and blankets with them. "We're staying here tonight," Emma announced, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request. "Zoe said we need to be together, and she's right." Richard should have objected. Dr. Garcia had been explicit about rest, but the sight of the 4 sisters, their earlier conflict apparently resolved, arranging their makeshift beds on the floor beside him, filled him with a peace no medication could provide. As they settled in, Sophie approached with a paper in hand. Richard recognized the portrait she'd given him in the hospital, now carefully taped back together. "I'm sorry I tore it," she said quietly. "I was angry and scared." "I understand," Richard assured her. "Sometimes the things we create out of love are the first casualties of our fear." Sophie returned to her blanket nest, the mended portrait placed deliberately where Richard could see it. Lily had already fallen asleep, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Wyoming. Emma sat upright, clearly planning to keep watch through the night, and Zoe, to everyone's surprise, began to sing softly, a lullaby in a language Richard didn't recognize, but that clearly held meaning for the sisters. As the gentle melody filled the room, Richard felt his breathing ease slightly. The monitors beside his bed registered the improvement, a small but measurable change. Science might attribute it to the new medication protocol or the advanced oxygen delivery system. Richard, however, knew the truth. His healing had begun the moment 4 small figures had appeared in his doorway, carrying pillows and unshakable determination, to keep their fragile family together. Matthew Townsend stood at the window of his penthouse apartment, staring at the glittering Manhattan skyline. At 42, he cut an impressive figure, tall and fit with the same steel-grey eyes as his uncle, but none of the illness that had diminished Richard's once commanding presence. On the coffee table behind him lay scattered files, medical, reports, financial statements, and surveillance photos of 4 identical little girls entering Townsend Manor. His phone rang, displaying his attorney's number. "Tell me you have good news, Samantha," he answered without preamble. "Define good," Samantha Winters replied, her voice crisp and professional. "Judge Harriman has granted our request for an independent medical evaluation of your uncle, but denied the emergency removal of the children. The hearing is still scheduled for Monday." Matthew frowned. "That's not good enough. Those girls have been living in his house for months now. Who knows what they've been told to say?" "Children are notoriously difficult witnesses," Samantha reminded him, "especially when they've formed attachments. Our strategy needs to focus on Richard's declining health and the instability it creates for these minors. And the financial angle. We have the affidavits from 3 former board members questioning his recent decision-making, and the medical records clearly show cognitive fluctuations during oxygen deprivation episodes." Matthew turned from the window, picking up a framed photograph from his desk. Himself as a young man standing beside Richard at the groundbreaking of Townsend Tower, both smiling, Richard's hand on his shoulder. It seemed like another lifetime. "This isn't just about money, Samantha," he said quietly. "Of course not," she agreed smoothly. "It's about protecting your uncle's legacy from his own impaired judgment and ensuring these children receive appropriate care in a stable environment." After ending the call, Matthew poured himself a scotch and returned to the window. Below him, the city continued its relentless rhythm, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding in its midst. His gaze drifted uptown, toward where Townsend Manor stood overlooking the Hudson River. His thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of the intercom. "Mr. Townsend, there's a Ms. Harrison here to see you. She says she's from Child Protective Services." Matthew straightened his tie. "Send her up." Eleanor Harrison was not what Matthew had expected. Rather than the stern bureaucrat he'd imagined, she was a thoughtful-looking woman in her 50s, with kind eyes that nevertheless missed nothing. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment," she said, as she settled into the offered chair. "I prefer to conduct these interviews without advance preparation. It yields more authentic responses." "Interviews?" Matthew repeated, caught off guard. "Yes, Mr. Townsend. As the petitioning relative in this case, you're subject to the same evaluation process as your uncle." She removed a tablet from her bag. "I've already completed multiple visits to Townsend Manor and extensive interviews with Richard and the girls. Now I need to understand your perspective and plans." For the next hour, Matthew found himself answering increasingly pointed questions about his relationship with Richard, his knowledge of child development, and his plans should he gain guardianship of the girls. They would, of course, be placed in the finest boarding school, he explained. Given their unusual situation, separation might actually help them develop individual identities instead of functioning as a unit. Ms. Harrison made a note. "And on holidays? Weekends?" "They would come here," Matthew gestured around his apartment. "I'd convert the guest room. 1 room for 4 children?" "Temporarily," Matthew amended. "I'd purchase a larger residence eventually." "Mr. Townsend," Ms. Harrison said, looking up from her tablet, "in your petition, you expressed concern about the girl's influence over your uncle. Could you elaborate on that?" Matthew chose his words carefully. "My uncle is a brilliant businessman who built an empire from nothing, but he's also a dying man who never had children of his own. These girls appeared suddenly, with no documentation, no background checks, nothing. Within weeks, he's changing his will, redirecting company resources, and making decisions that contradict his entire business philosophy. Such as, he's halted development on the Riverside project, a $1 billion investment, to redesign it as some sort of housing community for foster children. This from a man who once called social housing financial suicide. Ms. Harrison's expression remained neutral. People's priorities often shift when facing health challenges, wouldn't you agree? Shift, yes. Transform overnight, no. Matthew leaned forward. Look, I'm not the villain here. I'm concerned about my uncle being manipulated during a vulnerable time. And I'm concerned about 4 young girls being subjected to the trauma of watching their guardian's health deteriorate. Yet you're proposing to separate them and send them to boarding school? For their own good, Matthew insisted. They deserve stability, not a front-row seat to terminal illness. After Ms. Harrison left, Matthew poured another scotch and sat heavily on his sofa. The interview had not gone as he'd hoped. Despite his careful preparation, he'd felt defensive, as if he were the one being judged rather than Richard. His phone chimed with a news alert. Townsend Enterprises announces new direction. Affordable housing initiative to break ground next year. Attached was a photo of Richard in a wheelchair on the manor's terrace. The 4 girls gathered around him as he spoke to reporters via video conference. Matthew threw his glass against the wall, watching it shatter. It was exactly the kind of project he had proposed 6 years ago, the vision that had cost him his position in the company and his relationship with his uncle. The memory of that board meeting still burned. He had prepared for months, developing a comprehensive plan to transform underutilized Townsend properties into mixed-income housing communities with integrated social services. He'd been so certain Richard would be proud, would see it as the natural evolution of the Townsend legacy. Instead, Richard had dismantled the proposal point by point, questioning not just its financial viability, but Matthew's understanding of the real estate market itself. Sentimentality has no place in business, Richard had concluded. When you learn that lesson, perhaps you'll be ready for real responsibility. The humiliation had been complete. Within a year, Matthew had attempted to rally board members to his vision, a move Richard characterized as attempted usurpation. His removal from the board and estrangement from the family business followed swiftly. Now, watching Richard implement the very vision he had once mocked, with 4 mysterious children by his side, Matthew felt a complex mixture of vindication and bitterness. His uncle was finally recognizing the merit of his ideas, but giving credit to these children instead of his own flesh and blood. A new text from Samantha interrupted his brooding. Judge, requesting financial disclosure from both parties need complete records. ASAP. Matthew sighed, moving to his home office to retrieve the necessary documents. As he sorted through files, he came across an old folder labeled Harlem Youth Center Proposal, his first attempt at convincing Richard to invest in community development, presented the year after he joined the company. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard. Ambitious but premature. Develop your business acumen first, then your social conscience. For a moment, Matthew allowed himself to remember the early days, how proud he'd been when Richard had taken him under his wing after his father's passing, how determined he'd been to prove himself worthy of the Townsend name. When had it all gone so wrong? His reflections were interrupted by a breaking news alert on his laptop. Richard Townsend hospitalized again. Townsend Enterprises shares drop 3%. The accompanying article mentioned complications related to his ongoing lung condition and noted that the future of his controversial adoption bid remains uncertain. Matthew stared at the screen, unexpected emotions surfacing. Despite their estrangement, despite the legal battle brewing between them, Richard was still his uncle, the man who had taught him to tie a tie, who had attended his college graduation, when his parents couldn't, who had believed in his potential enough to bring him into the family business. Before he could examine these feelings further, his phone rang again. It was Samantha. "Matthew, we need to move quickly," she said without greeting. "Richard's hospitalization changes everything. I've already filed an emergency motion for temporary conservatorship based on his incapacity." "Is he really that bad?" Matthew asked, surprised by his own concern. "Bad enough that we can make a compelling case," Samantha replied pragmatically. "This is our opportunity, Matthew. Once we have control of the financial decisions, we can address the guardianship issue from a position of strength." After the call ended, Matthew found himself returning to the window, gazing in the direction of Mount Sinai Hospital, where his uncle now lay. The cityscape between them seemed to represent the vast gulf that had opened in their relationship, a space filled with misunderstanding, resentment, and missed opportunities for reconciliation. On his television, the financial news channel was discussing the implications of Richard's hospitalization for Townsend Enterprises. The analyst speculated about succession plans, mentioning Matthew as the estranged nephew and former heir apparent who was now challenging his uncle's competency. Is that how history would remember him? As the nephew who waited for his uncle to fall ill, then swooped in to claim the empire? Matthew turned off the television and reached for his phone, scrolling to a number he hadn't called in years. His finger hovered over Richard's contact information for a long moment before he set the phone down without calling. Some bridges, once burned, were not easily rebuilt, especially when both parties believed themselves to be in the right. Instead, he opened his laptop and began reviewing the legal documents Samantha had prepared. The case against Richard's guardianship was strong on paper. His deteriorating health, the girl's mysterious background, the sudden changes in business strategy. Yet something about it felt hollow, a technical victory without moral weight. On the screen of his muted television, the special report continued. The camera cut to footage of Townsend Manor, where reporters had gathered at the gates. In the background, Matthew glimpsed a group of 4 small figures watching from an upstairs window, identical faces pressed against the glass, their expressions solemn as they observed the media circus below. For the first time, Matthew allowed himself to really see them, not as threats to his inheritance or manipulators of his uncle, but as children caught in an adult battle not of their making. Children who, according to the reports he'd obtained, had already lost one parent and now faced losing another. He thought of his own childhood, the privileged but emotionally barren landscape of boarding schools and summer camps, the constant sense that he was an afterthought in his parents' busy lives. Was that really what he wanted for these girls? Matthew closed the laptop slowly, his certainty wavering. The legal machinery he had set in motion now seemed to be carrying him toward a destination he wasn't sure he wanted to reach. Yet pride and momentum made changing course nearly impossible. In the silence of his apartment, with the city lights casting long shadows across the floor, Matthew Townsend confronted an uncomfortable truth. In his quest to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his, he might be becoming exactly what Richard had once accused him of being: someone who placed ambition above compassion, strategy above humanity. The realization left a bitter taste, more potent than the expensive scotch now drying on his wall. The morning of the hearing arrived with a solemn weight hanging over Townsend Manor. Richard had been discharged from the hospital the previous evening against medical advice, but with Dr. Garcia's reluctant support. "If you're determined to attend this hearing," she had told him, "you're better off spending the night at home conserving your strength." Now, as dawn broke over the Hudson River, Richard sat in his wheelchair beside the window, oxygen flowing. Through his nasal cannula, watching the girls prepare for what might be the most important day of their young lives. Mrs. Henderson had laid out matching dresses, navy blue with white collars, formal without being ostentatious, and Emma was helping Zoe with her hair while Lily polished everyone's shoes to a mirror shine. "You don't have to come to the courthouse," Richard told them for the 3rd time that morning. "Jonathan says Judge Harriman would accept video testimony." "We're coming," Emma said firmly, meeting his gaze in the mirror as she braided Zoe's hair. "We're a family. We face things together." Sophie, who had been unusually quiet all morning, approached Richard with a folder. "I made something for you to take to court," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a series of portraits, Richard reading to the girls in the library, the 5 of them planting the yellow oak, Emma helping Richard with his breathing exercises, Lily singing while Richard played the piano, Zoe and Richard sharing yogurt in the kitchen. Each drawing captured an intimate moment of their life together, rendered with remarkable skill and emotional depth. "These are beautiful, Sophie," Richard said, genuinely moved. "But I'm not sure the judge will—" "They're not for the judge," Sophie interrupted gently. "They're for you, so you remember what we're fighting for." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. Before he could respond, Jonathan arrived with an update on the courtroom logistics. "We'll enter through the private entrance to avoid the media," he explained, nodding toward the gates where several news vans had already gathered. "Dr. Garcia will testify first, followed by Ms. Harrison from CPS, then Richard. The girls will be last, speaking directly to Judge Harriman in her chambers rather than the open courtroom." "And Matthew?" Richard asked. "Already there with Samantha Winters. They've submitted additional medical opinions questioning your capacity." Jonathan hesitated before adding, "Richard, I need to prepare you. Winters is brutal in cross-examination. She'll try to provoke an episode, elevated heart rate, oxygen desaturation, anything to demonstrate your physical vulnerability." Richard nodded grimly. "I'm prepared, John. Let's get this over with." The journey to the courthouse was mercifully uneventful. As promised, they were ushered through a service entrance, avoiding the reporters clustered at the main steps. Richard's wheelchair was guided into the courtroom through a side door, the girls following closely behind, their expressions a mixture of awe and apprehension at the imposing wood-paneled room. Matthew was already seated at the opposite table, his posture rigid in an impeccable suit. When he turned and saw Richard's wheelchair, something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or concern quickly masked. Their eyes met briefly before Matthew looked away, leaning to whisper something to Samantha Winters. Judge Harriman, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, entered and called the court to order. "Given the sensitive nature of this case and the involvement of minors," she announced, "I'm limiting media access. This is a family matter, not a public spectacle." The proceedings began with Dr. Garcia's testimony, a clinical assessment of Richard's condition. "Yes, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis is progressive and terminal," she acknowledged under Samantha's questioning. "And yes, Mr. Townsend has experienced cognitive fluctuations during severe episodes." "Fluctuations that could impair judgment?" Samantha pressed. "Temporarily," Dr. Garcia clarified. "But Mr. Townsend's baseline cognitive function remains excellent, and these episodes are both manageable and increasingly rare under our current treatment protocol." When Jonathan cross-examined, Dr. Garcia spoke about the unexpected stabilization in Richard's condition. "In my 20 years of practice, I've rarely seen such a response. While I can't scientifically attribute it to psychological factors alone, the correlation between his improved stability and the presence of the children in his life is statistically significant." Ms. Harrison's testimony followed, detailing her observations from multiple home visits. "The environment at Townsend Manor is exceptionally nurturing," she stated. "The children are thriving academically and emotionally. They've formed a secure attachment to Mr. Townsend, and he has demonstrated remarkable insight into their individual needs." Under cross-examination, Samantha focused on the girls' mysterious background. "These children appeared with no documentation, no verifiable history. Doesn't that concern you as a child welfare professional?" "Of course it's not ideal," Ms. Harrison admitted, "but it's not uncommon for children who've experienced housing instability. What matters most is their current safety and well-being, which by all measures is excellent in Mr. Townsend's care. Even with his significant health challenges," Samantha pressed. "Mr. Townsend has implemented comprehensive contingency plans," Ms. Harrison replied firmly. "The manor is staffed with qualified caregivers. The children have established relationships with multiple responsible adults, and Mr. Townsend has been transparent with them about his condition in age-appropriate ways." When Richard was called to testify, Jonathan helped him position his wheelchair in the witness stand. Up close, Judge Harriman could see the physical toll of his illness, the thinness of his frame, the slight bluish tint to his lips despite the oxygen, the way his hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in. Yet when he spoke, his voice was clear and his mind sharp. He described finding the girls during the snowstorm, the immediate connection he had felt, and the transformation they had brought to his life. "Your Honor, I've built skyscrapers and shopping centers. I've closed billion-dollar deals and created thousands of jobs, But nothing in my life has given me the purpose that these 4 girls have. They aren't just receiving my care, they've taught me what it means to be part of something larger than myself. Samantha's cross-examination was as ruthless as Jonathan had predicted. She questioned Richard's ability to physically care for the children, the wisdom of exposing them to his medical crises, and the rapid changes to his business strategies since their arrival. "Isn't it true," she asked with surgical precision, "that you've halted the Riverside project, a development you championed for years, and replaced it with a social housing initiative remarkably similar to the one your nephew proposed 6 years ago? The same proposal you publicly ridiculed?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Richard glanced at Matthew, whose expression remained unreadable. "Yes," Richard admitted. "Matthew's vision was ahead of its time and ahead of my understanding. I was wrong to dismiss it." "So you now believe your business judgment 6 years ago was flawed?" "I believe my priorities were flawed," Richard corrected. "I valued profit over purpose, expansion over impact. The girls haven't changed my mind, Ms. Winters. They've changed my heart." As the questioning continued, Richard's oxygen levels began to drop, the monitor on his wheelchair beeping softly in warning. Ms. Jenkins stepped forward with an adjustment, but Samantha pounced on the moment. "You see, Your Honor, even the stress of this hearing is triggering a medical event. How can we expect Mr. Townsend to manage the daily challenges of raising 4 active children?" Before Judge Harriman could respond, a small voice rang out from the gallery. "Because he doesn't do it alone." All heads turned to see Lily standing. In the aisle, her face flushed with indignation. Emma tried to pull her back to her seat, but Lily shook off her sister's hand. "We help each other," Lily continued, addressing the judge directly. "When Richard needs rest, we read quietly or do our schoolwork. When he has doctor appointments, we make get-well cards. When he has bad days, we know exactly what to do because Ms. Jenkins taught us." Judge Harriman's stern expression softened slightly. "Young lady, I appreciate your loyalty, but there's a proper procedure." "Zoe was mute for a whole year after our mom left," Lily pressed on, the words tumbling out. "She didn't talk to anyone, not even us. But she talks to Richard." Sophie stopped, drawing after the last foster home, but now she fills whole sketchbooks. "Emma can finally sleep through the night without checking on us every hour, and her voice caught, "I can laugh again without feeling guilty." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harriman studied Lily for a long moment, then nodded. "I think we'll proceed directly to the children's testimony in my chambers. Mr. Russell, Ms. Winters, you may submit written questions, but I'll conduct the interviews personally." For the next 2 hours, Richard waited anxiously while each girl spoke privately with the judge. When they finally emerged, their expressions gave nothing away. Judge Harriman returned to the bench, reviewed her notes carefully, then looked up to address the courtroom. "This case presents extraordinary circumstances that require extraordinary consideration," she began. "I've heard medical testimony, expert opinions, and most importantly, I've listened to the children themselves." She turned her attention directly to Richard. "Mr. Townsend, there is no question that your health presents significant challenges to traditional guardianship. However, I find the bonds you've formed with these children to be genuine and nurturing. The stability you've provided has clearly fostered their healing and growth." Then she addressed Matthew. "Mr. Townsend, your concerns about your uncle's health are valid from a medical perspective. However, I find no evidence of cognitive impairment or undue influence. Rather, I see a man whose priorities have evolved in the face of both illness and unexpected connection." Her gaze returned to the entire courtroom. "After careful consideration, I am denying the petition for conservatorship. Mr. Richard Townsend remains competent to manage his affairs." Richard closed his eyes briefly in relief, while Matthew's jaw tightened. "Regarding guardianship," Judge Harriman continued, "I am granting temporary legal guardianship of the 4 minors to Richard Townsend, with a review in 6 months. During this period, social services will work to establish their legal identities and search for any potential relatives as required by law." She paused, then added, "I am also appointing Matthew Townsend as contingent guardian to assume responsibility only in the event of Richard Townsend's incapacitation or inability to serve. This unexpected ruling sent a shock through the courtroom. Richard and Matthew exchanged startled glances, while the girls looked confused and alarmed. "Your Honor," Jonathan began to object, but Judge Harriman raised her hand. "My decision reflects the reality of Mr. Townsend's health prognosis, while honoring the family bonds that have formed. These children deserve both stability now and security for the future. The two Mr. Townsends will need to find a way to communicate and cooperate for the benefit of these 4 young lives." With that, she adjourned the court. As the gallery began to empty, Richard motioned for Jonathan to bring his wheelchair closer to Matthew's table. "We should talk," Richard said quietly to his nephew. Matthew hesitated, glancing at Samantha, who was already gathering her documents and signaling her disagreement. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "My office tomorrow at noon." As they left the courthouse through the private exit, reporters shouted questions from behind the barriers. Richard ignored them, focusing instead on the 4 solemn faces surrounding his wheelchair. "What does this mean?" Emma asked once they were safely in the car. "Is Matthew going to take us if you get sick again?" "No," Richard assured her, though the certainty in his voice exceeded his actual confidence. "It means we have 6 months to make our case even stronger, and it means I have 6 months to repair a relationship I should have valued more all along." The girls exchanged glances, clearly unconvinced. Back at the manor, Richard was exhausted from the day's events. As Ms. Jenkins helped him prepare for bed, he could hear the girls whispering in the hallway, their voices carrying an urgency that concerned him. "They're planning something," Ms. Jenkins remarked. "They've been huddled together since we got home." Before Richard could respond, his breathing suddenly became labored, a sharp pain spreading across his chest. Ms. Jenkins immediately increased his oxygen flow and reached for the emergency medication, her movements efficient, but her expression worried. "Should I call an ambulance?" she asked, already reaching for her phone. Richard shook his head, focusing on controlling his breathing as he'd been taught. After several tense minutes, the episode began to subside, leaving him drained, but stable. "Just a reaction to the stress," he wheezed. "I'll be fine after some rest." Ms. Jenkins looked skeptical but nodded. "I'll stay in the monitoring room tonight just in case." After she left, Richard lay in the darkness, his thoughts circling back to the judge's ruling. Matthew as contingent. Guardian? It was either a stroke of judicial genius or a recipe for disaster. Could his nephew set aside his resentment to truly care for the girls if necessary? The Matthew he had once known, idealistic, compassionate, determined, certainly could have. But the man in that courtroom today, hardened by years of perceived rejection, Richard wasn't so sure. He was drifting towards sleep when his door creaked open. 4 small figures slipped into his room, moving with the quiet coordination that had become their hallmark. "Richard," Emma's whisper came through the darkness. "Are you awake?" "I am now," he replied softly. "What's wrong?" Instead of answering, the girls formed a circle around his bed. In the dim light from the monitoring equipment, he could see they were holding hands. Zoe, to his surprise, began to sing the same lullaby he had heard that night after his return from Wyoming, a gentle, haunting melody in a language he didn't understand. One by one, the others joined in, their voices blending in perfect harmony. Emma reached out and placed her hand on Richard's chest, directly over his heart. Sophie touched his forehead, Lily his shoulder. Zoe, still singing, leaned close to his ear and whispered something. A single word in what might have been their mother's native language. Richard felt an extraordinary warmth spreading through his body, radiating outward from each point of contact. His breathing, which had been labored even after the episode subsided, suddenly came easier. The monitor beside his bed, which had been showing concerning numbers all evening, began registering improvement, slight at first, then more significant. The monitoring room. Ms. Jenkins stared at the readings in disbelief. There was no medical explanation for what she was seeing. Heart rate normalizing, oxygen saturation climbing, blood pressure stabilizing, all without intervention. She rushed to Richard's room, pushing open the door to find the 4 girls surrounding his bed. Their small hands placed strategically on his body, their voices raised in a song she'd never heard before. She started to speak, to question what was happening, but something in the scene before her made her pause. Whatever was occurring in that room went beyond her medical training. Instead of interrupting, she quietly backed out, closing the door behind her. Inside, Richard felt himself sliding into the deepest, most restful sleep he had experienced since his diagnosis. His last conscious thought was a mixture of wonder and gratitude, not just for whatever inexplicable healing the girls might be channeling, but for the pure, unconditional love that had brought them to his room in the middle of the night, determined to help the way only they could. Family takes care of family, Emma had said. In that moment, Richard understood it wasn't just a platitude, it was the most profound truth he had ever encountered. 5 years later, the yellow oak tree had grown remarkably in the years since its planting, its branches now spreading wide, enough to provide shade for the small gathering beneath it. Richard Townsend sat in a comfortable outdoor chair rather than a wheelchair, an oxygen concentrator humming quietly beside him, but the nasal cannula notably absent. At 75, he remained thin, his movements measured, but the deathly pallor that had once defined him had given way to a healthier complexion and alert eyes. "They're late," he remarked to Jonathan, who stood nearby checking his watch. "Traffic. On the bridge," Jonathan replied. "Sarah just texted, they're 10 minutes out." Richard nodded, his gaze traveling across the manor's expansive lawn, now transformed into a venue for the day's celebration. Staff members made final adjustments to the buffet tables and sound system, while a photographer captured candid moments of early arrivals. In the distance beyond the property's edge, construction equipment marked the progress of the Townsend family homes, the first of 10 planned residential communities designed specifically for foster families and children transitioning to permanent homes. The medical miracle that had occurred the night after the custody hearing had defied explanation. Dr. Garcia had ordered extensive tests, finding a measurable regression in Richard's pulmonary scarring, not a cure, but an unprecedented stabilization that had gradually improved over months. The scientific papers documenting his case used terms like spontaneous regression and idiopathic improvement, but Richard knew the truth lay beyond medical terminology. Whatever had happened that night, whether energy healing, psychosomatic, breakthrough, or something more mystical, had granted him the one thing he'd needed most: time. Time to secure the girl's future, time to heal old wounds, time to build a legacy beyond steel and concrete. The sound of tires on gravel announced new arrivals. Richard straightened, smiling as he recognized the silver SUV pulling up to the designated parking area. Matthew stepped out from the driver's side wearing a casual suit and an expression far softer than the one he'd worn in that courtroom 5 years ago. From the passenger side emerged his wife, Clara, whom he had met through his work with the Townsend Foundation's community outreach program. The back doors opened, and 4 teenage girls piled out, laughing as they untangled themselves in their overnight bags. Though still identical in their features, the quadruplets had embraced their individuality in appearance and style. Emma, now 13, wore her hair in a practical ponytail, her outfit suggesting the business casual of a young professional. Sophie's hair fell in artistic waves, paint smudges visible on her hands despite obvious attempts to clean them. Lily practically bounced across the lawn, her colorful dress matching her perpetually sunny disposition. Aunt Zoe, no longer silent but still the most thoughtful, carried a journal tucked under her arm, her observant gaze taking in every detail of the homecoming. "Uncle Richard!" they called in near unison, quickening their pace as they spotted him. Chiat stood to embrace them, marveling as he always did at how they had grown. What had once been a height, reaching barely to his waist, now extended to his shoulders, with Emma already threatening to overtake him within the year. "How was the leadership conference?" he asked Emma, who had spent the weekend at a young entrepreneurs event in Philadelphia, with Matthew and Clara serving as chaperones for all 4 girls. "Amazing," Emma replied enthusiastically. I met the CEO of that sustainable construction company we researched. She's going to video call with my school club next month. Matthew approached more slowly, carrying the girls' larger suitcases. She impressed everyone, he confirmed, setting down the luggage. The organizers thought she was at least 16. The relationship between uncle and nephew had required conscious rebuilding. That meeting in Matthew's office after the hearing had been tense, filled with recriminations and unresolved pain on both sides. Yet the judge's ruling had forced a partnership that, over months of cautious cooperation, had evolved into genuine reconciliation. The catalyst had been Richard's unexpected invitation for Matthew to review the plans for the Riverside project's transformation. "This was your vision before it was mine," Richard had acknowledged. "I need your perspective." Slowly, the walls between them had lowered. Matthew had initially approached his role as contingent guardian as a legal obligation, maintaining a formal distance from the girls. But their inherent charm had eventually worn down his reservations, particularly when Zoe, in one of her rare but significant observations, had noted, "You're alone too much. It makes your eyes sad like Richard's used to be." Now, 5 years later, Matthew and Clara had become integral to the girls' lives, providing additional stability and another layer of family connection. The contingency guardianship had never been activated, but the relationship it had forced had proven invaluable for everyone involved. "Everything's ready for the ceremony," Jonathan informed Richard as they moved toward the main event area. "The mayor will arrive at 2 along with the representatives from Child Protective Services." Richard nodded, his heart swelling with pride as he watched the girls greet the arriving guests, foster families who would soon move into the first, completed Townsend family homes. Each residence had been designed according to the principles the girls had established: security, doors that locked from the inside; light, generous windows; life, a garden space for each family; and comfort, quality furnishings that made a house feel like a home. The transformation of Townsend Enterprises had been as remarkable as Richard's medical improvement. The corporate focus had shifted from luxury developments to a hybrid model that balanced profitable ventures with community-centered projects. Matthew, reinstated to the board and eventually named COO, had proven instrumental in navigating this evolution, his early idealism now tempered by business acumen, but never extinguished. As 2 o'clock approached, the guests assembled beneath a tent erected near the yellow oak. Richard took his place at the podium, flanked by the 4 girls and Matthew. The mayor of New York, the press, and representatives from various child welfare organizations filled the audience. "10 years ago," Richard began, his voice stronger than anyone who had known him in his illness would have thought possible, "Townsend Enterprises was focused exclusively on building higher, more luxurious, more profitable properties. We measured success in square footage and sale prices." He gestured toward the construction visible beyond the property line. "Today, we break ground on our 10th Townsend family home community. These aren't just buildings, they're sanctuaries designed specifically for children who need stability, security, and the chance to grow roots. Each home accommodates no more than 8 children with resident care providers, offering the intimate, family environment that institutionalized care cannot provide." Richard turned slightly, acknowledging the 4 girls beside him. "The architects of this vision stand with me today, not just as my daughters, but as the co-founders of the Townsend Family Foundation." One by one, the girls stepped forward to explain the community's core principles. Emma spoke of security and stability. "Every child deserves to feel safe, to know where they'll sleep each night, to have consistent adults they can trust. Our homes are designed with security features that protect without feeling institutional, because safety isn't just physical, it's emotional." Sophie described the emphasis on beauty and creative expression. "Healing environments need beauty. Each home includes art studios, music spaces, and gardens where children can process their experiences through creative outlets. We believe that beauty isn't a luxury. It's essential to healing." Lily explained the community integration aspects. "These aren't isolated facilities. They're homes within neighborhoods with connections to schools, parks, and community resources. Because belonging isn't just about where you live, but how you live within a larger community. Finally, Zoe stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. Family isn't defined by blood or surnames. Family is who stays when everyone else leaves. It's who brings light into darkness. It's who calls you back when everything inside you wants to give up. Her simple definition brought tears to many eyes in the audience. Richard reached for her hand, squeezing it gently in gratitude for the wisdom that continued to surprise him, even after all these years. As the official ceremony concluded and guests mingled during the reception, Richard found a moment of quiet beneath the yellow oak. The medical equipment that had once dominated his existence was now reduced to a portable concentrator, he used only during physical exertion. Dr. Garcia still monitored him regularly, still marveled at the regression of his disease, still used the word unprecedented in her reports. Matthew approached, handing him a glass of water. "The mayor wants to discuss expanding the program to Brooklyn," he said, sitting in the adjacent chair. "I told him we'd need to complete this phase first, but the interest is encouraging." Richard nodded, observing the girls across the lawn as they guided visitors through a display of architectural models. "They're remarkable, aren't they?" "They are," Matthew agreed. "They've changed everything." The simple acknowledgement carried layers of meaning that both men understood without elaboration. The girls had changed Richard's prognosis, Townsend Enterprises' direction, and the fractured relationship between uncle and nephew. They had transformed a mausoleum-like mansion into a home filled with laughter, arguments, homework, and the organized chaos of real family life. "Do you ever wonder about that night?" Matthew asked quietly, referring to the inexplicable improvement in Richard's condition, something he had initially dismissed as medical anomaly, but had gradually come to view with more openness. "Every day," Richard admitted. "Dr. Garcia has her theories about stress reduction and psychological factors. The alternative medicine specialists suggest energy healing or quantum something or other," he smiled. "I prefer the simplest explanation." "Which is?" Richard's gaze followed the girls, Emma explaining the community's business model to an impressed city council member, Sophie showing a young foster child how to use the art supplies set up for the event, Lily organizing an impromptu game with several families, Zoe sitting quietly with an anxious-looking boy, somehow knowing exactly who needed her particular brand of gentle attention. "Love," Richard said simply. "Not the greeting card version, but the kind that transforms. The kind that sees possibility where others see problems. The kind that builds instead of destroys." Matthew considered this, watching Clara join Lily's game, her laughter blending with the children's. "You know, that vision I had all those years ago for the company, it wasn't just about affordable housing or social responsibility. No, it was about purpose, about building something meaningful." Matthew turned to his uncle. "You gave me that in the end. Not the way either of us expected, but maybe the way we both needed." Richard nodded, understanding the journey they had taken, from mentorship to estrangement to reconciliation, with 4 unexpected catalysts accelerating the healing. "We build differently now," he agreed. "We build homes, not just houses." The afternoon progressed. Guests gradually departed until only the core family remained. They gathered on the terrace for dinner, the conversation flowing easily between business updates, school anecdotes, and plans for the summer. "We should visit the ranch again," Lily suggested, referring to the Wyoming property that had been the site of Richard's medical crisis 5 years earlier. "We never got to finish our horse riding lessons." "I'd like that," Richard agreed, realizing the location no longer held fearful associations. "Perhaps in August, before school starts." Twilight settled over the grounds, Sophie disappeared briefly, returning with a large, wrapped canvas. "We made something for today," she announced as her sisters gathered around. Richard unwrapped it carefully, revealing a magnificent collaborative painting. Sophie's artistic skill had created the framework, a detailed rendering of Townsend, Manor with the yellow oak in the foreground, but each sister had contributed elements that reflected their journey together. Emma had added architectural details of the family homes project. Lily had painted joyful figures throughout the grounds. Zoe had inscribed a border of words in multiple languages: family, home, belonging, love. At the center, beneath the oak, stood 6 figures: Richard, Matthew, Clara, and the 4 girls, hands joined in an unbroken circle. "It's for the foundation headquarters," Sophie explained, "so everyone remembers how it started." Richard studied the painting, emotion making, speech difficult. The contrast between the lonely, dying man he had been and the surrounded, purposeful person he had become could not have been captured more perfectly. A small child from one of the foster families approached, shyly offering Richard a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the manor's meadow. "Thank you for building us a house," she whispered. Richard accepted the flowers, inhaling their fragrance as a single tear of peaceful contentment traced down his cheek. His empire had indeed been transformed, from cold, gleaming towers to warm, welcoming homes. The legacy he would leave behind wasn't measured in square footage or profit margins, but in lives changed, in families formed, in children who would grow up knowing security and belonging. As evening deepened, the family moved inside, but Richard lingered a moment longer on the terrace, gazing up at the stars emerging in the twilight sky. His illness remained a reality, managed rather than cured, stabilized rather than eliminated. One day, inevitably, it would progress again, but that knowledge no longer haunted him. He had been given the most precious gift possible, not just extended time, but meaningful time. Time to heal old wounds with Matthew, time to see the girls grow from frightened, homeless children into confident young women with purpose. Time to redirect his considerable resources toward creating the kind of security for others that he had found so unexpectedly for himself. The yellow oak stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its branches reaching upward like outstretched arms. From inside came the sounds of piano music, Lily teaching Clara a duet, and laughter as Emma and Matthew debated some business principle while Sophie and Zoe set the table for dessert. Richard smiled, thinking of that snowy night 5 years ago when he had spotted 4 small figures huddled beneath an awning. He had thought he was rescuing them, never imagining they would be the ones to rescue him, not just from physical decline, but from the far more profound poverty of a life without family. He had built an empire of steel and glass.